Welcome to week 13 of Historical Geography. It's good to be back with you again, and thank you for joining us. I wanted to tell you a little bit about why we do week 13 the way that we do week 13. Okay, so last couple of weeks we have been breaking up week 13 into separate different sections. And this is one of those days on our trip that's a long day. It's day 7 usually on our itinerary. And at this point we're actually based in Jerusalem, but we'll take the bus up from Jerusalem and head north into Samaria. And it's not a very long bus ride, but there's so much that's of biblical significance up in this area. And I can tell you that not a lot of tours make their way up into this area, partly because it's West Bank today, and some are scared by that reality. There's nothing to be afraid of up there, but some people stay away just because of that. Sometimes it feels like it's a little bit out of the way from Jerusalem. Maybe you don't want to get back on the bus or whatever it might be. But I think it's incredibly important to take people up here. And one of the reasons for that is that each of these places that we've looked at has some claim in biblical history for being a capital city. Okay, so we looked at Shechem last time, right? And if you'll remember, Shechem is that place where Abimelech tries to become king over Israel in the footsteps of his father Gideon. Now Gideon, of course, was a judge, and he did not want him or his sons to become a monastic ruler. He didn't want them to be from one generation to another over Israel as their king. And so when Abimelech tries to become king, he does that there at Shechem. But he's not successful, as you know. He's not the first king of all 12 tribes, but he does try to unite them in that one place. And then later on in Shechem's history, of course, we have where the kingdom actually does divide. So after Saul, David, and Solomon, on Solomon's death in 931, Shechem is the place where Jeroboam makes the northern kingdom of Israel. And that's where he tells Judah to go back home. And so Judah and Benjamin go back down to the south, and they form the nation of Judah. And then the 10 tribes that are left up in the north, they become the nation of Israel. And so that happens right here at Shechem, and Shechem will be the capital city for some time for Jeroboam until he builds another city to take that place of that. Okay, so Shechem could have been, and actually did function as the capital city for Israel for some time. Then we also looked at Shiloh, and Shiloh obviously has a lot of significance as well. As we said, the tabernacle sat there for about 370 years. And so there's good reason to see Shiloh as the capital, certainly of the 12 tribes of Israel under Joshua and during the period of the Judges, because that's where the tabernacle was located for so much of that time. So people would have come there for the festivals, they would have come there to give sacrifices, and we certainly saw that in 1 Samuel with Hannah and her family coming there to worship the Lord and to seek him at the tabernacle. Okay, so Shiloh could have been the capital of Israel. Today we're going to come to 2 more places, again, places that aren't visited very often by tour groups. That's Bethel and Ai. Now Bethel has tremendous significance for Old Testament history. It will be the place where Abraham first encounters the Lord. Right after the Abrahamic covenant is given in Genesis chapter 12, this is the place where Abraham will encounter the Lord there. His son Jacob also will encounter the Lord there. And then down into history, right, where Jeroboam, after the start of the divided kingdom, when Jeroboam splits that kingdom in half, he puts one place of worship down here at Bethel. Again, one of them up at Dan as well, a place that we've already been to. So Dan and Bethel become the centers of worship for that northern kingdom for all of its history. And so it actually has some claim to be the capital city too. Again, the place where God encountered Abraham and Jacob and others, and then becomes a place where false worship takes place under Jeroboam and the northern kingdom. And so certainly these places have huge significance in terms of things that happened in them. They're also great places, I think, to overlook the geography of Israel. From Ai, for instance, we get a very clear view of what the country looks like up in the neighborhood of Ephraim, up in what will become Samaria eventually as well. And from there we can actually see all the way down into the Rift Valley. And so I love to take people there just to experience what the topography feels like there. Now again, not much to see there in terms of ruins, and in fact what we will talk about today for Bethel and Ai are often disputed by archaeologists and historians as the actual places where these things happened. But I can tell you confidently that it was within miles of where we're going to be in these 2 places here. And I actually think there's good reason for believing that the very places that we will be when we go, and the very places that I will show you in pictures today, are the places where these things happened. And so very exciting to me. Please join us as we walk through, first of all, a PowerPoint here to show you, again, the map to get us oriented in time and space, the timeline a bit as well, and then we'll look at some pictures. So let's go to the PowerPoint for that now. All right, this is week 13, part 3. We're going to be at Ai and Bethel, and I wanted to show you some pictures and a video or two and give you a bit of an orientation again for where we are. So we're going to start as we normally do with a map. And here we go. This is our normal map here where we have the Mediterranean Sea here, the Arabian Desert here to get our bearings. And again, this is Jerusalem. Got Sea of Galilee up here, the Dead Sea down here, the Jordan River flowing between them. Again, Mount Carmel out here. And again, we're in this area right here, which is Ephraim and Samaria. I'm going to show you a little bit closer. This is what it looks like from the satellite view, this West Bank area here. That's where we're at. And we have been up at the north of this area, now moving our way back down south. So we're getting closer and closer to Jerusalem as we come back this way. Again, here are all the cities that we've visited so far, if you've been following for the first 13 weeks. Last week we were up here, Shechem, Shechem and Sychar, and then down into Shiloh, sorry about that. And now today we're going to be in Bethel and Ai. You can see how close they are in proximity to each other, also not that far from Shiloh. Jericho being down just here, which is also important for us. And so Jericho, you can see the just the proximity from Jericho to Ai and then up to Bethel as well. Remember also Jericho would have been 1,700 feet below sea level, and now we're moving up into Ai, which would have been much higher than that, quite a bit above sea level by that point. This is what the modern area of Bethel looks like. This is the modern city of Beitin. You can see right in the center here is a mosque, and this whole area here would have been Bethel. Now this has been excavated, but then reburied, and we'll talk about that a bit later on. When they were given permission to do the excavations in the early 20s, it was only on the condition that they would rebury it because people's fields, as you can see, are in here, so their livelihood came from these places. This is the Byzantine church, and you can see the walls. Actually, this is the nave of it here. You can see the curve that comes around this way. This is the one that was built between Ai and Bethel, on the spot that we will come to see is very important biblically. It's the spot where Jacob had his vision of the ladder going up and down to heaven. It's a spot on which Abraham stood when God told him that he would give him this entire land to the north, east, south, and west from here. Okay, so this is extremely important for an Old Testament spot, the place between Bethel and Ai. This is also that church, and what I want you to see here is the thickness of the walls. Okay, so this is an outer wall and inner wall, so this would have been the walls of the church, very thick, which means that this building was meant to support, or this foundation, these walls were meant to support a very large and prominent building. Probably 2, 3, maybe even 4 stories high. Okay, so that's the walls. Not much left to see there in Bethel today. In fact, we'll talk about that a bit later. Here is another part of that church. You can see the stone work that's happened here. If you look very carefully right in this area, you can see carvings, some decorations on that are Byzantine era carvings. And so you can see what that would have looked like on the exterior of that building there. This would have been plastered on the outside here, and you can still see a bit of the carvings that were a part of that, the old building there from probably the 3rd or 4th century AD. Again, here's that nave. You can see the rounded edge of it here, and actually it faces out towards Ai, down towards Jericho as well, would be down in that region as well. So this would have been the nave, the important spot there, likely built on top of an earlier building that would have commemorated that place where Abraham talked with God and met with God there, built an altar, and then again Jacob, his descendant, also came back to this very spot a number of times. We'll get to that in the biblical narrative coming up soon. This is the view from that spot looking down towards Ai. Okay, so you're right now standing in that area between Bethel and Ai, and now you're looking down. You can actually see almost see down to the Jordan Rift Valley down here. That's where the Dead Sea is down here as well. And Ai would be just behind this hill. Okay, so there's a hill between Bethel and Ai, and then behind it, this tower here actually stands on the modern Ai. Okay, so you can't see Ai from here, but you're looking in the direction of it, and it's only 1.5 miles or 2 miles to Ai from this spot here. Okay, I mentioned that the very first biblical event that takes place at Bethel is in Genesis chapter 12. And again, if you've taken classes from me, you know that the Abrahamic covenant happens in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. And immediately after that, the scene actually is set here at Bethel, or to be more precise, between Bethel and Ai. And I want to set the stage for you just to understand how Abraham and his descendants lived. Remember, they were nomads, the patriarchs, meaning that they had flocks and herds that they would take with them, but they never really had a place where they settled down and built cities. Now, there were cities at that time, but these cities were not places where they permanently dwelled. And so Abram and Jacob and Isaac and others in those generations would be wandering from place to place, watching over their flocks and herds, but then would occasionally come and dwell outside of cities. And so some of the action takes place not in the city of Bethel, but in the hill country right next to it. And so that's where we're going to be standing today, as an actual place where a church has been built to commemorate what happened here on this spot. So I want to take you to the scriptural portion first. We're going to go to Genesis chapter 12. If you have your Bibles, that's great. Please do follow along. I think it's good to actually have your Bible and see it on the pages of Scripture. But I'll also put it up for you to view as well here on the screen. So we're going to go to Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verses 4 through 9. Turn in your Bibles there now. Genesis 12, 4 through 9. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's sons, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran. And they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord, who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going toward the Negev. So we see here that Abram's going to move from this hill country. He's been up there in Shechem and built a well there. And now he moves to Bethel and builds an altar there as well. And now he moves with his flocks and herds down into the Negev, down into that southern portion where we were at just a couple of weeks ago. So Abram, as you can see, is nomadic, but there's for some reason, they keep coming back to this place at Bethel, and God keeps encountering them there. So let's go to the next portion of Scripture, and we'll see that further on. So I want to emphasize with you on this point that during this period of the patriarchs, Abram, Isaac, Jacob, they're all semi-nomadic, which means that they are camping between cities or next to cities, not in cities. Now, we may have talked about this earlier in historical geography, but I want you to remember that cities in ancient times were not the places where people lived for the most part. They were places where commerce took place, so there's trading that happens there. They would be places where judgments would take place, so legal documents, those kinds of things would be processed in a city. And they were also places of protection. When there's an invasion or if there's a series of raids that are going on, then people would congregate in cities. But for the most part, they lived out with their flocks and their herds. So if they were farmers, they were out in their fields with their crops, with their vineyards. If they're like Abram and the patriarchs, then they're actually nomadic. They're moving along with their cattle, with their sheep and goats and herds of all different kinds. And so moving them around to the best places to feed them. But then obviously every once in a while coming in contact with a city. But when they come to a city, they don't come into the city, obviously. They're not moving those flocks and herds into the walls of a city, because cities would have been small, and you just don't walk in with your hundreds of cattle. And so when it talks about Abram being camping between Ai and Bethel, that's just a picture to have in your mind. Okay? These events don't take place in the cities that we're talking about here in Genesis. They're taking place in the countryside around there. So I'm going to take you to another place where Abram comes back to exactly the same location as where he had been before. We're going to go down to Genesis chapter 13. And in Genesis 13, if you can notice what happened between 12 and 13, Abram and Sarai have gone down as far as the Negev, and then gone even further south into Egypt, and there's a famine in the land. And you'll remember that story because Abram had told the Pharaoh in Egypt that Sarai was his wife, was not his wife, was his sister instead of his wife. And you remember that episode. He ends up leaving Egypt with even more cattle and riches than he had before he went down into Egypt. God blesses him in spite of his sinful action there. And so that's where we find ourselves in Genesis chapter 13. He's coming back up out of Egypt and returning up into the land that God had met him at. So let's go to Genesis chapter 13, and we're going to be reading from 1 to 17 now. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that they had, and Lot with him, into the Negev. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold, and he journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Then Abram said to Lot, Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted up his eyes, and saw that the Jordan valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. I just want to stop there, pause for just a second. So Sodom and Gomorrah likely would have been down south, and they would have been to the southern edge of what is now the Dead Sea. But what I find interesting about this is when Lot and Abram are there, and they look over that land, what they find is something, a green pasture-like land, like they say, just like the Garden of Eden down there, like the Garden of the Lord. Today, if you go down to that area, it's dry and arid and desert-like. Nothing really grows down there except for on the very banks of the Jordan River, and where there are some springs that shoot up in certain locations. But for the most part, that is a desert wasteland down there. Okay? And so today, I think the topography has actually changed. And what changed? Well, it was what happened at Sodom and Gomorrah there. When God destroyed them, he actually created a dam, I think, at the end of the Dead Sea, which caused the Dead Sea to be dead. Remember, one of the reasons that the Dead Sea is dead is because a lot of water does flow into it, but nothing flows out of it. And so it sits there and it stagnates and it evaporates, and all of the mineral deposits are left there. And so it becomes very mineral rich, very salty in content. And that is the case because it no longer flows through. I think it probably used to flow all the way from Mount Hermon in the north, down through the Sea of Galilee. Then the Jordan River continued on into what is now the Dead Sea, and it probably continued to flow all the way down into the Red Sea, down to the south. Today, of course, it doesn't continue to flow there, and it shrinks, and it dries up, and it leaves behind all of these deposits. And I think it's actually because of what happened in the coming story here. All right, let's go back to our text, verse 11. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley, and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward, and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. Okay, so that's the section in Genesis 13 there. Now we're going to skip down a couple of generations. Okay, so Abram obviously becomes Abraham, and then you move on to Isaac, and then his son, Jacob. So this is Abraham's grandson, Jacob, that we encounter in Genesis chapter 28. And what's interesting is, in each of these places, God is renewing his covenant with the succeeding generations of Abraham's descendants. So in Genesis chapter 12, it is introduced, the Abrahamic covenant, to Abraham. But then it is renewed with him in Genesis 17, and a little bit more detail is given to him. And then in succeeding generations as well, God will come back to the descendants of Abraham, and he's going to list these promises again for them, renewing the covenant with the successive generations. And so quite a bit of time passes, obviously, between Genesis 13 and Genesis 28, but we're going to make our way down there now. So turn to Genesis chapter 28, and we'll begin reading in verse 1. And I want you to hear how much is similar between what we just read in Genesis 13 and what we see here in Genesis 28. So look for similarities, and I'll try to emphasize those as I read as well. So Genesis 28, beginning in verse 1. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. And he came to a certain place and stayed there that night, because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed. And behold, there was a ladder set upon the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Does that sound familiar? Behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob woke from his sleep, and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid, and said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. Now that house of God, that actually is Bethel. Beth means house, El means God, house of God. Verse 18, So early in the morning Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head, and set it up for a pillar, and poured oil on it on the top of it. He called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at the first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone, which I have set up for a pillar, shall be God's house. And all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you. Okay, one thing I wanted to emphasize here, look in verse 19 again. He says he called the name of that place Bethel, which it had been called before by Abraham, remember? But the name of the city was Luz at the first. Okay, so he's not in the city, he's outside of the city. The place called Bethel at this point is actually outside of the city, and the city gets renamed Bethel over time as well. Okay, shift your attention again. Years later, after Jacob marries Rachel and Leah, God will once again direct him to return to this place. And we're going to skip down to Genesis chapter 35, and we're going to start reading in that chapter as well, beginning in verse 1. So go down to Genesis 35, and again, Jacob will return to this very same place. Beginning in verse 1. God said to Jacob, Arise, go up to Bethel, and dwell there. Make an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, Put away the foreign gods that are among you, and purify yourselves, and change your garments. Then let us arise and go up to Bethel, so that I may make there an altar to the God who answers me in the day of my distress, and has been with me wherever I have gone. So they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods that they had, and the rings that were in their ears. Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree that was near Shechem. And as they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities that were all around them, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. And Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him. And there he built an altar and called the place El Bethel, because there God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother. And Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried under an oak below Bethel. So he called its name Allon Bakuth. God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram, and blessed him. And God said to him, Your name is Jacob. No longer shall you be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel. And God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. The land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you. Then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him. And Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone. He poured out a drink offering on it, and poured oil on it. So Jacob called the name of the place where God had spoken with him Bethel. Right? Several times this place is called Bethel, and renamed that because it is the house of place in the Old Testament. Again, when you go there today, there's absolutely nothing there to see. Even the people who live there, they're probably built on top of all of these places that were thought to be sacred ground or something along those lines in the Old Testament. They don't treat it like anything sacred today. There's no tabernacle there. There's no major buildings to be seen there. There's no museums there. There's not even very many archaeological things to be observed there. It's one of those places that has been forgotten over time. And I think that part of the reason that it's been forgotten over time is some of the things that take place there later. And we'll get to that in just a moment. But there's one place I want to take you before things change quite drastically for Bethel, and that is in Judges. The book of Judges mentions Bethel just one time, and it's in Judges chapter 20, verses 24 to 27. And it's just an interesting side note. This is where the Ark of the Covenant was at least temporarily, during the time of the judges. For most of the period of the judges, we believe that the ark was actually kept in Shiloh, and we've talked about that in the earlier episode. But now we come to a place in Judges where it's mentioned as being at Bethel. So let's go there now. Judges chapter 20, verses 24 to 27. Put it up here on the screen for you again. So the people of Israel came near against the people of Benjamin the second day. And Benjamin went up against them out of Gibeah the second day, and destroyed 18,000 men of the people of Israel. All these were men who drew the sword. Then all the people of Israel, the whole army, went up and came to Bethel and wept. They sat there before the Lord and fasted that day until evening, and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, for the ark of the covenant was there in those days. Again, just a kind of a brief mention, an aside mention of it here. This is as the book of Judges starts to draw to a close. Things are getting worse and worse. In fact, Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin, has been completely destroyed almost. At that point, there's only about 600 men left in all of Benjamin. And so things have gotten about as bad as they can get in the book of Judges. And just one aside mention there of Bethel. We're going to skip ahead quite a bit more, and I want to show you a timeline at this point and just give you an idea of where we have moved from. Okay, so we have the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we'll find that there on the timeline. And then we look briefly at the time of Judges, which is right on this part of the timeline. And now we're moving into the time of the divided kingdom. Okay, think about this again. Orient yourself in time. This is after Saul, David, and Solomon, the first three kings of Israel, the ones that ruled over all 12 tribes, at least to some degree. What's the period that is called the Divided Monarchy. But then when Solomon dies, because he has been idolatrous, he's allowed idolatry into his kingdom, has allowed his wives to practice idolatry, has probably participated in it himself, and has let his people fall into idolatry as well. Because those things have happened, God has ripped the kingdom out of his hands. And it will no longer be all 12 tribes together as one kingdom. And so Jeroboam will be the king of the 10 tribes that go up to the north and continue to call themselves Israel, while we'll have another kingdom in the south, ruled initially by Rehoboam. And those are only two tribes, just Benjamin and Judah. And the kingdom will be called Judah down there to the south. And so now we're going to look at that point in history where this happens. And one of the first things that Jeroboam does when he establishes his new kingdom is he says that that they need to be careful about allowing people to go to worship in the place that they're called to worship back down there in Jerusalem. And so this is what happens. Bethel really takes on further significance, though in a much more negative light, as the divided kingdom begins. Remember that when Jeroboam seizes the 10 tribes and breaks from Judah after Solomon's death in 931, one of the first things that he does is he establishes false places of worship. One in Dan, further up in the north, of the very northern section of Israel, and one down here at Bethel, the very southern part of the kingdom, so that Israel will not have to return to Jerusalem to worship. And let's see about how do you think God feels about that. We're going to go to 1 Kings chapter 13. So fast forwarding quite a few years in history, hundreds of years in history, in fact, from the time of the Judges. Now to 1 Kings chapter 13. Let's look at this section, beginning in verse 1. And behold, a man of God came out of Judah by the word of the Lord to Bethel. Jeroboam was standing by the altar to make offerings. And the man cried against the altar by the word of the Lord, and said, O altar, altar, thus says the Lord, Behold, a son shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name. And he shall sacrifice on you the priests of the high places who make offerings on you, and human bones shall be burned on you. And he gave a sign the same day, saying, This is the sign that the Lord has spoken. Behold, the altar shall be torn down, and the ashes that are on it shall be poured out. And when the king heard the saying of the man of God, which he cried against the altar at Bethel, Jeroboam stretched out his hand from the altar, saying, Seize him. And his hand, which he stretched out against him, dried up, so that he could not draw it back to himself. The altar also was torn down, and the ashes poured out from the altar, according to the sign that the man of God had given by the word of the Lord. And the king said to the man of God, Entreat now the favor of the Lord your God, and pray for me, that my hand may be restored to me. And the man of God entreated the Lord, and the king's hand was restored to him, and became as it was before. And the king said to the man of God, Come home with me, and refresh yourself, and I will give you a reward. And the man of God said to the king, If you give me half your house, I will not go with you, and I will not eat bread or drink water in this place. For so it was commanded by me by the word of the Lord, saying, You shall neither eat bread nor drink water, nor return by the way that you came. So he went another way, and did not return by the way that he came to Bethel. Okay, so we see in this passage how God feels about this opening up of a false place of worship there in Dan and Bethel. Right, this isn't just a trivial thing. This isn't Jeroboam trying to pray and appease the God of Israel by creating new places of worship. This is against what God has called for in this place. And so we'll see later, in fact we won't talk about it today, but you will know later in history that Josiah will indeed come and break down the altars in Dan and Bethel, and he will make some reforms, religious reforms, not just in the southern kingdom of Judah, but even up here as far as Dan and Bethel in the north in Israel too. Just one more event to cover here at Bethel, and it will come to us in 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 23 to 25. It's a strange little event. It's one that maybe doesn't fit in with the rest of what's happened here, but I do think it shows the general decline from the time of Abram down through Jacob, and then when we had in Judges, and now what we had in Kings as well. We have seen a decline in this place from a place that was a holy place where Abram and Jacob met with God to a place that is one of the centers for false worship for the northern kingdom. A very sad place indeed. And now we'll find even another sad event that takes place right here, 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 23 to 25. This is about Elisha and his experience. It says this: He, that is Elisha, went up from there to Bethel, and while he was going up on the way, some small boys came out of the city and jeered at him, saying, "Go up, you bald head, go up, you bald head." And he turned around, and when he saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. And 2 she-bears came out of the woods and tore 42 of the boys. From there he went on to Mount Carmel, and from there he returned to Samaria. So like I said, just another brief little encounter here, but I think it does show the decline of the sense of holiness in a place like this, where even a prophet of God is scorned and scoffed at by these young boys, calling him a bald head. Interesting little passage there. And as we know, Josiah will come and he will do reforms and he'll stop the false worship that happens here. And yet the northern kingdom will go on to be completely destroyed and taken away by Assyria. And so the false worship that took place here at Bethel under the northern kingdom will lead to its complete destruction. And so that is what we had for Bethel. My intention was to include Ai with this section, but as I've been recording, I've figured out that this is a little bit longer than I thought it would be, and so we're going to go ahead and treat Ai separately. And so our next one for chapter 13 or week 13 will be actually lesson D, and that will be on Ai. So join us for that one, and we'll have that one available for you soon. Thanks. Bye.